He invited his poor ex to his wedding to shame her. She arrived pregnant with a billionaire and a Maybach with twins. Brandon Cooper sent the wedding invitation to his poor ex-wife thinking he'd finally watch her break, that she'd show up small and defeated while he stood at the altar with a dynasty heiress on his arm. But when those wrought-iron gates groaned open and a pearl-white Maybach rolled through, the woman who stepped out wasn't broken. She was draped in blood-red silk, pregnant, dripping in diamonds, with twin boys in designer suits and a billionaire whose net worth could buy Brandon's entire wedding venue without checking his account balance. What Brandon didn't realize was that by inviting Monique Harris to witness his victory, he'd just handed her the stage for the most devastating revenge she never even had to plan. If you're ready to enjoy this story, click that subscribe button, like this video, and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more wonderful stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's get into the story. The string quartet's melody floated through the rose garden like silk on water, each note a carefully orchestrated promise of perfection. Late afternoon sunlight spilled through the branches of ancient oaks, casting golden patterns across white chairs tied with satin bows. The air was thick with the scent of gardenias and champagne, delicate and expensive. Guests whispered in hushed, elegant tones about the union they'd gathered to witness, the marriage of Brandon Cooper, Esquire, to Lindsay Hart, daughter of the Hart Hotel dynasty. For months, Atlanta's society pages had chronicled the engagement, each detail more lavish than the last. This wasn't just a wedding, it was a statement. To Brandon, it was vindication. Proof that he'd outgrown his humble beginnings, climbed the ladder of respectability, and secured his place among those who mattered. He stood at the altar beneath an arch dripping with white roses and wisteria, his tuxedo custom-tailored to emphasize his shoulders, his posture rehearsed to project confidence without arrogance. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his jaw set at an angle he'd practiced in the mirror that morning. He looked like success personified, like a man who'd earned every inch of his rise. Beside him stood Lindsay, pristine in a gown of French lace and ivory silk, her blonde hair swept into an elegant updo that must have taken hours. Her beauty was calculated, magazine perfect, the kind that belonged on covers rather than in messy, vulnerable moments. She held her bouquet of white peonies like a trophy. Lindsay wasn't the type to giggle or blush. She was here because Brandon's ambition aligned with her family's appetite for expansion. Their union was strategy dressed as romance, a merger with vows. Both understood the arrangement, but beneath Brandon's polished exterior, something unsettled churned. Even as the quartet played, even as guests turned to admire him, he felt it gnawing at his chest. Monique. The memory of his first love clung to him like smoke he couldn't quite clear. He remembered her laughter bouncing off the walls of their cramped studio apartment, the way she'd mock his obsession with designer labels while wearing thrift store sundresses that somehow looked better than anything Lindsay owned. He remembered late nights studying together, her hand in his, her belief in him so fierce it had once felt like fuel. She had been warmth where Lindsay was frost, sincerity where Lindsay was strategy. But Monique hadn't fit the life Brandon wanted. She'd been a stepping stone, a chapter he'd closed without ceremony, leaving her behind like outdated furniture. The breakup had been brutal, a text message sent while she was at work. "I need someone who fits where I'm going." In his circles, she'd become a whisper, a cautionary tale about ambition's cost. And yet, when the gold-embossed invitations were printed, Brandon had ensured one found its way to Monique's last known address. Not out of kindness, out of cruelty. He wanted her there, tucked in some back row, forced to watch him claim everything she could never give him. He wanted to see her diminished. He wanted her to know she'd been outgrown. The quartet's notes hung in the air. and the guests shifted in anticipation. The ceremony was about to begin. Brandon straightened, his lips curving into a satisfied smirk. Then the iron gates groaned open. But what arrived was not the shame Brandon had scripted. It was Monique Harris. She stood framed in the garden's entrance, and the world seemed to tilt toward her. Her gown was blood-red silk, cut to perfection, draping elegantly over her pregnant belly. Her dark skin glowed against the rich fabric, her natural curls swept into a style that was both effortless and regal. Diamonds glinted at her throat and wrists, not costume jewelry, but the kind of stones that whispered old money. In each hand, she held the fingers of a child. No, 2 children. Identical twin boys with bright eyes and confident smiles, dressed in tailored yellow suits that made them look like tiny princes. Their presence alone was a statement. And beside her, tall and commanding in a black tuxedo that fit like armor, stood Alexander Pierce. His reputation arrived before he did. Venture capitalist, visionary, the man whose portfolio included tech unicorns and luxury brands that shaped culture. His wealth wasn't new. It was generational, the kind that built museums and funded universities. But more than money, Alexander carried something intangible, authority. When he entered a space, the space rearranged itself around him. And now he stood beside Monique as though she were the only treasure that mattered, his hand resting protectively on the small of her back. Behind them, the pearl-white Maybach idled at the curb, its presence as loud as a proclamation. She hadn't come broken. She had come untouchable. The garden erupted into whispers, heads turning like dominoes. "Is that her? My God, she's stunning. Those boys, are they his? Pierce came himself. For her. That dress must have cost." The murmurs swelled, building into a wave that drowned out the string quartet. Brandon's chest constricted. His grip on Lindsay's hand faltered, though he forced it steady again, his knuckles whitening. This wasn't possible. This wasn't how it was supposed to unfold. Monique's gaze found his across the expanse of roses and white chairs. Her eyes were calm, unreadable, but there was something there, something that said she no longer existed in his orbit, that she had risen beyond his reach, beyond his petty need for validation. She didn't need to say a word. Her presence said everything. You tried to bury me. I became a garden. But 6 years ago, Monique Harris had been a different woman entirely. She'd been the girl who woke at 5 a.m. to the sound of her mother's alarm clock rattling through the thin walls of their East Atlanta apartment. The girl who studied by the glow of a desk lamp while her mother, Diane, pulled double shifts, one at the diner on Ponce de Leon, the other cleaning office buildings downtown. The girl who understood, long before she had words for it, that survival required sacrifice. Monique's childhood had been painted in shades of almost enough money for new shoes, almost enough time for her mother to attend school plays, almost enough space in their one-bedroom apartment where Monique slept on a pull-out couch and did homework on a TV tray. But what they lacked in material comfort, Diane made up for in fierce, unrelenting love. "You're going to college," she'd said 1,000 times, her hands raw from bleach and dish soap. "You're going to have choices I never had." So Monique worked. She juggled classes at Georgia State University with shifts at a campus bookstore, a weekend gig tutoring high schoolers, and occasional catering jobs that paid under the table. She wore thrifted blazers to interviews and learned to stretch $1 until it screamed. She was tired, always, but she was also determined, hungry for something better. And then she met Brandon Cooper. He'd been a year ahead of her, pre-law with plans to conquer the world one briefcase at a time. They met in the library during finals week, both reaching for the same dusty copy of constitutional law, cases, and materials. He'd smiled, charming, easy, the kind of smile that made you forget he was calculating even then. "You can have it," he'd said, though his eyes had already appraised her, cataloging her worn backpack and no-name sneakers. "But only if you help me understand Commerce Clause jurisprudence." She'd laughed. He'd leaned closer. And just like that, Monique fell. In the beginning, Brandon had been intoxicating. He talked about his future with the confidence of someone who'd already lived it. Corner office, tailored suits, invitations to galas where champagne flowed and connections were currency. He came from a working-class family, too, but he spoke about his roots like stains he was determined to bleach out. "We're going to make it," he'd whisper, pulling her close in his cramped apartment. "We're going to be somebody." Monique believed him. More than that, she believed in him. She became his anchor. When Brandon stressed about the LSAT, she quizzed him with flashcards she'd made by hand. When his part-time job cut his hours, she picked up extra shifts and slipped cash into his wallet, pretending she'd found it in her coat pocket. When he doubted himself at 3 a.m, she held him and recited all the reasons he'd succeed. But as Brandon climbed, his gratitude curdled into entitlement. The changes were subtle at first, the way he'd wince when she showed up to his networking events in a dress she'd worn twice before. The jokes he'd make about her mother's accent, laughing too loud with his new friends from the Young Professionals Society. "You gotta admit, babe, your mom sounds like she walked straight out of a Tyler Perry movie," he'd said once. And when Monique's face had hardened, he'd kissed her forehead and called it just teasing. It wasn't teasing. It was erasure. Brandon started spending more time with people whose parents owned lake houses and investment portfolios. He traded his thrift store button-downs for designer labels he couldn't afford, charging them to credit cards Monique didn't know about. He began critiquing her, gently at first, then with surgical precision. "Maybe don't mention you work at a bookstore when we're at these events. Just say you're in school. You should really invest in a good handbag. People notice that stuff." "Do you have to talk about Atlanta like it's the only place that exists?" Monique swallowed every barb because she loved him, because she believed they were building something together. Because he still whispered "we" when he talked about the future, even as he slowly edited her out of it. She paid his rent when his internship didn't cover expenses. She proofread his law school applications until her eyes burned. She skipped meals so he could take potential mentors to lunch. She poured herself into him like water into sand, never realizing she was disappearing. And then, one Tuesday in October, everything shattered. Monique had been at work, shelving textbooks in the campus bookstore when her phone buzzed. A text from Brandon. She'd smiled, expecting something sweet, maybe dinner plans. Instead, she read, "I've been thinking a lot lately. I think we're in different places. I need someone who fits where I'm going. I hope you understand. Take care of yourself." 23 words. No phone call, no conversation. No acknowledgement of the years she'd spent building him up, brick by brick, while she hollowed herself out. Monique read the message 3 times, standing frozen between shelves of biology textbooks, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Her hands shook, her vision blurred. Around her, students laughed and complained about exams, the world continuing as though hers hadn't just collapsed. She finished her shift on autopilot, walked home in the October chill, climbed the stairs to the apartment she still shared with her mother. Diane was at work. She was always at work. The apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic. Monique sat on the edge of her pull-out couch, still holding her phone, Brandon's message glowing on the screen. The tears came then, hot and wrenching, the kind that felt like they might tear her apart from the inside. She cried for the love she'd given so freely, for the future she'd imagined, for the girl she'd been before Brandon Cooper had made her feel like she wasn't quite enough. But even as she wept, something else stirred beneath the grief, something quiet and molten and unbreakable. She was devastated, shattered, humiliated, but she was not broken. Monique wiped her face with the back of her hand, her breathing still ragged, and made a promise to the empty room. He would regret this, not because she'd seek revenge, but because she'd become everything he couldn't imagine. She didn't know how yet, but she knew, with a certainty that felt like steel in her spine, that this was not her ending. It was her beginning. 3 weeks after Brandon's text, Monique Harris boarded a Greyhound bus to New York City with $200 in her bank account, a duffel bag of clothes, and a resolve that burned hotter than grief. She didn't tell Brandon she was leaving, didn't give him the satisfaction of knowing he'd shattered her world enough to make her run. She simply disappeared from Atlanta like smoke, leaving behind the girl who'd believed love meant making herself smaller. New York swallowed her whole. The city was nothing like the movies promised. No montages of her laughing in Central Park or landing dream jobs with a plucky smile. Reality was harsher, colder, unforgiving. Monique crashed on the couches of friends, people who tolerated her presence for a week or two before the silent hints began. She rotated between a cramped studio in Washington Heights, a cluttered apartment in Bushwick, and one particularly grim 2 weeks sleeping on an air mattress in someone's closet in Queens. She survived on dollar pizza and black coffee. She wore the same 3 professional outfits in rotation, hand-washing them in bathroom sinks and praying they'd dry overnight. She learned the subway system like scripture, memorizing transfers that saved her a single fare, counting every penny like it was oxygen. Her first job was as a receptionist at a mid-tier marketing firm in Midtown. She answered phones, organized files, fetched coffee for people who didn't bother learning her name. The pay was barely enough to cover a shared room in a Brooklyn apartment with 2 roommates who worked night shifts and left the kitchen perpetually sticky. But Monique watched, listened, learned. She noticed how the executives carried themselves, the tilt of their chins, the measured pace of their words, the way they commanded rooms without raising their voices. She studied their presentations, memorizing the rhythm of persuasion. She stayed late, reading strategy decks that were left on the printer, absorbing the language of branding and market positioning like a second tongue, and she felt the weight of being underestimated every single day, the subtle racism that came wrapped in politeness. "You're so articulate," clients would say, surprise dripping from the compliment, the way her ideas were overlooked in meetings, only to be praised when a white colleague repeated them verbatim. The assumptions that she was the assistant, never the strategist, even after she'd been promoted. The sexism was just as insidious. Men in expensive suits who let their eyes linger too long. Senior partners who called her sweetheart and honey while discussing 7-figure campaigns. The unspoken understanding that she had to work twice as hard for half the recognition. The classism cut deepest, the casual conversations about summer homes and European vacations, the inside jokes about prep schools and family connections. The way her colleagues wrinkled their noses when she mentioned growing up in East Atlanta, as though poverty were contagious. Monique absorbed every slight, every dismissal, every condescending smile, and she transformed them into fuel. She spent her evenings in the public library, devouring books on brand psychology, luxury market trends, and image consulting. She followed industry leaders on social media, dissecting their strategies. She saved every spare dollar, trading her thrift store blazers for one perfect designer piece at a time. A structured handbag from a consignment shop, a pair of classic pumps from a sample sale. Her style began to sharpen, her confidence calcified into something unshakable. And then came the turning point. It happened during a strategy meeting for a struggling luxury skincare brand. The client was on the verge of pulling their contract, unsatisfied with the campaign directions presented. Monique sat in the corner of the conference room, technically there only to take notes, watching senior strategists stumble through uninspired pitches. Something in her snapped. "May I?" she'd said, her voice cutting through the awkward silence. Her supervisor had blinked, startled. The client, a silver-haired investor named Richard Castellanos, had gestured for her to continue. Monique stood. She didn't have slides or graphs. She had only her voice and a vision that had crystallized in her mind during weeks of observation. "You're not selling skincare," she'd said, meeting Castellanos' eyes. "You're selling transformation. But your current branding speaks to vanity, not value. Women with disposable income don't want to be told they need fixing. They want to be told they deserve elevation. Your marketing should feel like an invitation to an exclusive club, not a solution to a problem." She'd continued for 7 minutes, weaving psychology and aspiration into a narrative that repositioned the entire brand. When she finished, the room was silent. Then Castellanos smiled. Who the hell is she? And why isn't she running this pitch? Within 6 months, Monique had left the firm to launch her own image consultancy, Harris & Company Brand Elevation. Her first office was a converted studio apartment in Soho, but it didn't matter. Word spread through New York's elite circles like wildfire. The woman who understood luxury without performing it. The strategist who could take a personal brand from invisible to iconic. The consultant who made her clients feel seen. Her client list grew. Actors preparing for awards season, executives navigating career pivots, socialites rebranding after scandal. She dressed differently now. Tailored sheath dresses, architectural jewelry, heels that made her stand taller not just physically but spiritually. She walked into rooms and owned them. Power lunches at the Grill, exclusive parties in Tribeca lofts, Fashion Week invitations. Her name mentioned in Forbes and Vogue business. Monique Harris had become the woman Brandon Cooper never imagined she could be. And then, on a frost-bright February morning, she walked into a marble and glass conference room on the 42nd floor of a building that overlooked Central Park, preparing to pitch a potential investor for her firm's expansion. She was early. The room was empty except for one man standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his back to her, hands clasped behind him as he gazed out at the city. He turned as she entered. Alexander Pierce. Monique recognized him instantly. Venture capitalist, visionary, the man whose portfolio read like a blueprint of the future. But what struck her wasn't his reputation or his tailored Tom Ford suit. It was the way he looked at her. Not at her body, not at her credentials, at her. As though he saw something beneath the polished surface, something worth knowing. "Monique Harris," he said, his voice low and warm. He didn't move to shake her hand yet, simply held her gaze. "I've heard remarkable things." She set her portfolio on the table, meeting his eyes with the confidence she'd earned through blood and sacrifice. "Then let me show you they're all true," she replied. And in that moment, neither of them knew they'd just met the person who would change everything. Alexander Pierce had been born into the kind of wealth that didn't announce itself. No flashy displays, no nouveau riche desperation to prove anything. His family's fortune was old, quiet, and vast, built over 3 generations through strategic investments, real estate holdings, and a venture capital firm that had seeded some of the most transformative companies of the digital age. But money had never been Alexander's defining feature. It was his character that set him apart. He'd been raised by a grandmother who insisted that privilege was a responsibility, not a trophy. She'd taught him to listen more than he spoke, to observe the weight people carried in their silences, to treat service staff with the same respect as CEOs. While his prep school classmates bragged about trust funds, Alexander volunteered at community centers. While they chased status, he chased substance. By the time he'd built his own venture capital portfolio, separate from his family's legacy, he'd earned a reputation not just for his business acumen, but for his integrity. He didn't invest in companies. He invested in people. And he could read people the way others read balance sheets. Which is why, when Monique Harris walked into that conference room, he'd noticed her presence before she spoke a single word. The pitch meeting had lasted 45 minutes. Monique presented her expansion plans with surgical precision, data-driven projections, market analysis, testimonials from clients whose careers she'd transformed. But what captivated Alexander wasn't the numbers. It was the fire beneath her composure, the hunger that came from having clawed her way up from nothing. When she finished, he'd leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "I'm in," he'd said simply. "But I'd like to discuss terms over dinner, if you're available." Monique had paused, studying him for calculation or ulterior motive. She'd found neither, only genuine interest. "Dinner," she'd agreed. "Professional." He'd smiled. "Of course." That first dinner stretched into 3 hours at a quiet Italian restaurant in the West Village. They talked about market trends and brand psychology, but the conversation kept drifting to books they'd loved, childhoods that had shaped them, the weight of wanting more than what you'd been given. Alexander didn't flinch when Monique mentioned growing up in East Atlanta, sharing a one-bedroom with her mother. Didn't change the subject when she spoke about working 3 jobs through college. Instead, he leaned forward, asking questions that showed he was actually listening. "What did that teach you? How did your mother's resilience shape your approach to risk?" He didn't want to erase her past. He wanted to understand it. Their romance unfolded slowly, elegantly, like a story being written in careful longhand. Alexander courted Monique with a patience that felt revolutionary after Brandon's transactional love. He sent thoughtful gifts, a first edition of a book she'd mentioned casually, reservations at a restaurant whose chef she admired. He showed up to her speaking engagements and sat in the back row, never making it about himself. He listened when she talked about her insecurities, the imposter syndrome that still crept in during vulnerable moments. And he didn't try to fix her. He simply held space for her truth. "You don't need me to complete you," he'd said one night, rain streaking the windows of his penthouse as they shared wine and comfortable silence. "You're already whole, but I'd like to build something with you, if you'll let me." Monique had spent so long armoring herself that his gentleness felt dangerous. She kept waiting for the catch, the moment he'd ask her to shrink or perform or prove her worth. It never came. Instead, Alexander challenged her to soften without losing her strength. To believe that love didn't require sacrifice of self, it required partnership between equals. When Monique discovered she was pregnant, a surprise that sent her into a spiral of fear and wonder, Alexander's response was immediate and unwavering. "We're going to be extraordinary parents," he'd said, his hand on her stomach, his eyes bright with something she'd never seen in a man before. Unconditional commitment. The twins, Caleb and Carter, arrived on a snow-bright January morning. 2 perfect boys with Alexander's eyes and Monique's fierce spirit. From the moment they were placed in his arms, Alexander was transformed. He changed diapers at 3 a.m., learned to make bottles one-handed, read parenting books with the same focus he brought to investment prospectuses. He didn't help Monique raise them. He raised them. Fully, equally, joyfully. Watching him with their sons, patient during tantrums, present during bedtime stories, wrestling with them on the living room floor in his $1,000 suit pants. Monique felt the last walls around her heart crumble. She fell in love not just with who Alexander was to her, but who he was when no one was watching. A man of quiet dignity and radical emotional intelligence. When he proposed, there were no flash mobs or jumbotrons. Just the two of them on the terrace of their home, the twins asleep inside, the city glittering below. Alexander had simply taken her hand and said, "I want to spend the rest of my life choosing you, every single day. Will you marry me?" Monique had cried, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of being fully seen and completely loved. "Yes," she'd whispered. "Yes." They'd married quietly 6 months later, a small ceremony with close friends and family. Diane had wept openly, clutching Alexander's hand and thanking him for loving her daughter so well. Life became a rhythm of richness that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with meaning. Morning chaos with the twins, strategy sessions where Alexander and Monique challenged each other's thinking. Date nights where they still talked for hours. And then the beautiful surprise of another pregnancy, a daughter due in 4 months. Monique had never imagined this kind of happiness was possible. And then, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, the mail arrived. Monique was in her home office reviewing client proposals when she noticed the envelope. Heavy cardstock, gold embossing, her name written in calligraphy. Ms. Monique Harris. She opened it absently, expecting a gala invitation or charity event. Instead, she found a wedding invitation. "Mr. Brandon Cooper and Ms. Lindsay Hart request the honor of your presence." Monique's hands stilled. She read the date, the venue, the ornate script that screamed expensive taste and hollow sentiment. For a long moment, she simply stared at Brandon's name, feeling nothing. No anger. No pain. No residual heartbreak. Just a profound, quiet understanding that the man who'd once made her feel inadequate was now completely irrelevant. Alexander appeared in the doorway, Caleb and Carter trailing behind him, their faces sticky with what appeared to be jelly. "Everything okay?" Monique looked up at her husband, this man who'd chosen every part of her, past and present, and smiled. "Everything," she said softly, setting the invitation aside, "is perfect." But Alexander's eyes had caught the embossed card. He picked it up, read it, and something sharp flickered across his face. Not jealousy, something colder, more strategic. He met Monique's gaze, one eyebrow raised. "Are you planning to respond?" Monique started to say no, started to throw it away and forget Brandon Cooper ever existed. But then she saw the look in Alexander's eyes, the quiet challenge, the unspoken question. "Would you like to arrive?" Alexander said slowly, a slight smile playing at his lips. "In a Maybach or a Rolls-Royce?" And just like that, Monique understood. This wasn't about revenge. It was about closure, about walking back into a space that once diminished her and showing, without saying a word, exactly who she'd become. She leaned back in her chair, one hand resting on her pregnant belly, and smiled. "The Maybach," she said. "Definitely the Maybach." For 3 days, the invitation sat on Monique's desk like a dare she wasn't sure she wanted to accept. She'd catch herself staring at it during quiet moments, between conference calls, while nursing her evening tea, in the early morning hours when the twins were still asleep and the penthouse was wrapped in pre-dawn silence. Brandon's name glared up at her in embossed gold script, a ghost from a life she'd shed like old skin. Part of her wanted to ignore it entirely, to prove she'd moved so far beyond him that he no longer warranted acknowledgement. She'd built an empire. She had a man who loved her with a purity Brandon couldn't comprehend. She was carrying a daughter, raising 2 beautiful sons, living a life so far removed from that cramped Atlanta apartment that it felt like a different universe. What did she have to prove? But something unsettled lingered beneath her certainty. A small, stubborn part of her that remembered the girl who'd cried on a pull-out couch, wondering if she'd ever be enough. The girl who'd believed Brandon's cruelty was somehow deserved. That girl deserved to see how the story ended. Alexander watched her wrestle with the decision, never pushing, only observing with that quiet, emotional intelligence that had made her fall in love with him. On the 3rd evening, as they stood on their terrace overlooking the city, he'd finally spoken. "You don't need to prove anything," he said softly, his hand finding hers. "Not to him, not to anyone. You've already won every battle that matters." Monique leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. "Then why does it still feel unfinished?" "Because closure isn't always about the other person," Alexander replied. "Sometimes it's about showing yourself how far you've come. But Monique," he turned her gently to face him, his dark eyes serious. "If you want to go, we do it on your terms, not as some petty revenge, but as a statement of fact. You walk in as exactly who you are, and you let that speak for itself." She'd kissed him then, grateful for a man who understood that strength didn't mean never looking back. It meant choosing how you faced what was behind you. "I want to go," she'd whispered against his lips. He'd smiled. "Then, let's make it unforgettable." The morning of the wedding, Monique stood in her dressing room, running her fingers over the gown she'd chosen. Blood-red silk that draped like liquid fire, cut to elegant perfection around her pregnant belly. The color was deliberate. Not white, not pastels, not anything that whispered apology or restraint. Red meant power. Red meant presence. Red meant look at me and remember what you lost. Her stylist had swept her natural curls into a style that was both effortless and regal. Diamonds glittered at her throat and wrists, gifts from Alexander, but more than that, symbols of a life she'd earned. In the adjoining room, she could hear Alexander helping the twins into their tailored yellow suits. Caleb was complaining about his bow tie. Carter was asking if there would be cake. Monique smiled, her hand resting on her belly where their daughter kicked gently, as if in encouragement. She walked into the boys' room, and both twins turned, their eyes widening. "Mama, you look like a princess," Caleb breathed. "No," Monique corrected gently, kneeling before them despite the restrictive gown. She adjusted Carter's collar, smoothed Caleb's jacket. "Princesses wait to be rescued. I'm a queen." "And so are both of you, princes who will grow into kings." She looked between her sons, her voice soft but firm. "Today we're going somewhere where people might stare. They might whisper. But you don't shrink, you don't hide. You walk in with your heads high, holding my hands, because you are Pierce boys. Do you understand?" "Yes, Mama," they chorused, standing a little straighter. Alexander appeared behind her, devastating in his black tuxedo, and met her eyes in the mirror. The look that passed between them needed no words. Ready, ready. The Maybach glided through Atlanta's tree-lined streets like a whisper of wealth. Monique sat in the back, the twins on either side of her, Alexander's hand resting protectively on her knee. The privacy partition gave them a cocoon of silence, broken only by the boys' occasional questions and the soft purr of the engine. "Mama?" Caleb's voice was small. "Are you nervous?" Monique looked down at her son, seeing his concern, and felt a rush of love so fierce it nearly stole her breath. She pulled him closer, kissing the top of his head. "No, baby, I'm not nervous." "Then why are we all dressed so fancy?" Carter asked, ever practical. Alexander answered before Monique could. "Because sometimes you have to remind people who underestimated you exactly who you've become. Not because you need their approval, but because you deserve to witness your own transformation." The twins nodded seriously, not fully understanding but trusting implicitly. As they neared the Chateau Manor, Monique felt Alexander's hand slide to her stomach, his thumb tracing gentle circles. She covered his hand with hers, and for a moment they simply breathed together. "You are magnificent," he murmured, "and I'm honored to stand beside you." Monique's eyes stung, but she blinked the tears back. Her makeup was perfect. Today was not for crying. The Maybach turned through the wrought-iron gates, and Monique felt her pulse quicken. Through the tinted windows, she could see guests milling about in their pastel dresses and summer suits, champagne flutes catching the afternoon sun. They looked comfortable, complacent, unprepared. The car glided to a stop at the entrance, and Monique could feel eyes turning even before the door opened. The shift in energy was palpable, curiosity rippling through the crowd like wind through wheat. Alexander squeezed her hand once. "Show them who you are." The driver opened the door. Monique stepped out first, and the world seemed to inhale. The red gown caught the sunlight, shimmering like flame. Her diamonds refracted light in 1,000 directions. Her skin glowed with the radiance of a woman completely at peace in her power. And when she turned to help her sons out of the car, the collective gasp was audible. Caleb and Carter emerged like tiny princes, their yellow suits a perfect, joyful contrast to her crimson elegance. They each took one of her hands, standing tall, just as she'd taught them. Then Alexander stepped out, tall, commanding, his presence a statement all its own. He moved to Monique's side, his hand finding the small of her back in a gesture so protective and proud that several guests actually stopped mid-conversation to stare. Whispers erupted like wildfire. "Is that... my God. Is that Monique Harris? Alexander Pierce. That's Alexander Pierce. She's pregnant. Those boys, are those his sons? That dress must cost... Did you see that car?" Monique didn't rush, didn't falter. She stood for a moment at the entrance to the rose garden, letting them look, letting them see, letting the moment crystallize into something they'd retell for years. Photographers, hired for the wedding, instinctively turned their cameras toward her. Flashes erupted like small suns. And Monique smiled, not smugly, not cruelly, but with the serene confidence of a woman who'd walked through fire and emerged not just unburned, but forged into something unbreakable. She didn't need to announce herself. Her presence did that for her. A queen among commoners, she thought, remembering Alexander's words. Then, with her son's hands in hers and her husband at her side, Monique Harris walked into Brandon Cooper's wedding and claimed it as her coronation. The string quartet resumed their melody, but the notes fell differently now. Hesitant, uncertain, as though even the musicians could feel the shift in the garden's atmosphere. Guests settled into their seats with an energy that hummed beneath the surface, their programs forgotten in their laps, their eyes drawn again and again to the third row where Monique sat like a portrait come to life. Brandon stood at the altar, his rehearsed posture suddenly feeling performative rather than confident. He forced his shoulders back, his chin up, his expression into something that was supposed to read as joy, but felt increasingly like a mask slipping. The ceremony was beginning. This was supposed to be his moment, his victory, his proof that he'd arrived. But no one was looking at him. Lindsay felt it first. the way a bride knows when she's no longer the center of her own wedding. She stood at the edge of the garden's entrance, bouquet trembling slightly in her manicured hands, waiting for her cue to walk down the aisle. Through her veil, she could see the rows of guests, their heads turned at odd angles, their whispers creating a low buzz that competed with the quartet. They weren't looking toward the altar. They were looking toward the third row. At her. Lindsay had spent 6 months planning every detail of this wedding. She'd selected the flowers herself, imported peonies that cost more than most people's monthly rent. She'd hired the most sought-after photographer in Atlanta. She'd starved herself for 8 weeks to fit into a gown that had been featured in Bridal Vogue. She'd choreographed this day down to the minute, envisioning herself as the singular focus, the undisputed star. But Monique Harris had walked in wearing red to a wedding, and somehow made Lindsay's ivory lace feel like wallpaper. The music swelled, signaling Lindsay's entrance. She began her walk down the aisle, each step measured and practiced. Guests rose dutifully, turning toward her, but their eyes kept sliding past her. Back to the third row, back to the woman in crimson with the diamond necklace that caught the afternoon sun like a challenge. Lindsay's grip on her bouquet tightened. Her smile felt frozen, unnatural. By the time she reached the altar, her jaw ached from holding it in place. Brandon took her hand, and she felt his palm sweating through her lace glove. She looked up at him, searching for reassurance, for the confidence he always wore like armor. But his eyes weren't on her. They kept darting over her shoulder. To the third row, to Monique. The officiant began speaking about love and commitment, his voice rich with practiced warmth. The words floated over the garden like bubbles, beautiful and hollow. Brandon tried to focus, tried to anchor himself in the moment. This was Lindsay Hart, daughter of the Hart Hotel dynasty, a woman whose last name opened doors, whose connections would accelerate his career trajectory by years. This was the logical choice, the strategic choice. But Monique sat 3 rows back, radiant and untouchable, and Brandon couldn't stop his mind from spiraling. She wasn't supposed to look like that. She was supposed to be struggling, diminished, a cautionary tale he could point to as evidence of his own ascension. She was supposed to remind him that he'd made the right choice in leaving her behind. Instead, she looked like she'd been carved from success itself. The gown, the diamonds, the children who sat on either side of her like small sentinels, and that man, Alexander Pierce, whose net worth made Brandon's salary look like pocket change, sitting beside her with his hand resting protectively on her thigh. Brandon's throat tightened. Sweat gathered at his collar. Around them, guests shifted in their seats. Whispers grew less subtle. Is that really her? His ex? She looks incredible. That's Alexander Pierce. The Alexander Pierce. I heard she's a brand consultant now. Works with celebrities. Those twins are adorable. Poor Lindsay. This has to be mortifying. Lindsay heard the whispers too. Each one landed like a small cut. She stood at the altar in her perfect dress beside her perfect fiancé, at her perfect wedding, and felt herself disappearing. Her posture began to collapse in increments, her shoulders curving inward, her smile wavering, her eyes, behind the veil, starting to sting with tears she couldn't afford to shed. Not here. Not with 300 guests watching her, comparing. The officiant gestured to Brandon. The groom has prepared his own vows. Brandon reached into his pocket for the folded paper he'd labored over, words he'd crafted to sound both heartfelt and impressive. His hands shook slightly as he unfolded it. He looked at Lindsay, tried to see only her, tried to remember why he'd proposed in the first place. The strategic alliance, the social elevation, the way her family's approval had felt like finally arriving somewhere that mattered. But over her shoulder, in his peripheral vision, he could see Monique, still calm, glowing like she'd swallowed the sun. He began reading. "Lindsay, from the moment I met you..." His voice cracked. He cleared his throat, started again. "From the moment I met you, I knew you were the kind of woman who..." Another pause. The words on the page suddenly felt hollow, borrowed, like someone else's truth. In the third row, Monique sat perfectly still. But in her mind, memories flickered like old film reels. Brandon's voice, sharp with contempt. "Kids? You want to talk about kids when we can barely afford this apartment?" His laugh when she'd mentioned starting her own business someday. "Babe, be realistic. You're not exactly MBA material." The way he'd introduced her at networking events, his hand never quite touching her back. "This is Monique. She's in school." His eyes scanning her outfit before they left for dinner. "Is that the best you have?" The text message. 23 words. No phone call. No conversation. Monique felt Alexander's hand find hers, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. She squeezed back, anchoring herself in the present, in the life she'd built, in the man who'd loved every part of her that Brandon had tried to erase. At the altar, Brandon stumbled over another line. "You represent everything I..." He stopped, swallowed. "Everything I've worked toward." Even Lindsay flinched at the phrasing. Everything I've worked toward. Not everything I've dreamed of. Not everything I love. Everything I've worked toward. Like she was a promotion, a acquisition, a prize. Brandon's vows continued, each word feeling more forced than the last. The guests shifted uncomfortably. The photographers, sensing the strange energy, captured wide shots instead of intimate close-ups. And through it all, Monique sat in the third row in her blood-red gown, one hand resting on her pregnant belly, her sons on either side of her, her husband's arm around her shoulders. She didn't smirk, didn't gloat, didn't need to. She simply existed, radiant, successful, loved, and let that existence speak for itself. Brandon reached the end of his vows, his voice barely above a whisper. The paper shook in his hands. He looked at Lindsay, trying to find something solid to hold on to. But Lindsay was looking past him now too. At Monique, at the woman who'd loved Brandon when he had nothing and been discarded like she was nothing. The woman who'd turned that rejection into rocket fuel. The officiant cleared his throat, moving the ceremony forward with professional efficiency. But everyone in the garden knew the truth. The wedding was still happening. But the moment belonged to someone else entirely. The ceremony ended with applause that felt more like obligation than celebration. Guests rose from their seats, the whispers growing louder now that propriety no longer demanded silence. Brandon and Lindsay walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, but the energy that should have buoyed them felt strangely flat, as though the garden itself knew this union was less love story and more business transaction. Lindsay's smile was glacial. Brandon's hand on her arm felt mechanical. Behind them, Monique remained seated for a moment longer, watching them pass. Alexander leaned close, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You don't have to stay. We've made our point." "Not yet," Monique said softly. She reached into the small clutch purse that matched her gown and felt the weight of the item inside. "There's one more thing." Alexander studied her face, reading the determination there, and nodded. "Then we finish this your way." The reception unfolded on the chateau's terrace, white-clothed tables arranged in elegant clusters, champagne towers catching the golden light, a live band playing jazz standards that drifted over the manicured lawns. Guests clustered in small groups, their conversations inevitably circling back to the same topic: the woman in red and the billionaire who'd arrived like characters from a different, more interesting story. Brandon and Lindsay stood at the center of it all, receiving congratulations that felt increasingly hollow. Every handshake came with a wandering eye. Every well-wish was followed by a glance toward the terrace's edge, where Monique stood with Alexander, the twins chasing each other in delighted circles nearby. Brandon downed his second glass of champagne too quickly. The alcohol burned but didn't settle the churning in his chest. He'd planned this day for months, every detail calculated to project success, to announce his arrival into Atlanta's upper echelon. But Monique's presence had rewritten the entire narrative. He was the groom at his own wedding, and somehow he felt like a supporting character. Lindsay excused herself to touch up her makeup, and Brandon found himself alone for the first time since the ceremony. He grabbed another glass of champagne from a passing server, his eyes scanning the crowd, and then he saw Monique walking toward him. She moved through the guests like water, effortless and unhurried. Her red gown drew every eye, but she seemed unaware of the attention, or perhaps just unbothered by it. Alexander hung back, giving her this moment, his hand resting on Caleb's shoulder as the twins watched their mother with curious eyes. Monique stopped a respectful distance from Brandon, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. 6 years collapsed into silence. "Congratulations," she said, her voice carrying none of the bitterness he'd half expected. It was a beautiful ceremony. Brandon cleared his throat, trying to summon the confidence he'd worn so easily just hours ago. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," Monique admitted. A small smile played at her lips. "But I'm glad I did. It gave me clarity." Before Brandon could ask what she meant, Monique reached into her clutch and withdrew a small box wrapped in understated silver paper. She held it out to him. "A wedding gift," she said. Brandon took it, feeling the weight, heavier than he'd expected. His fingers fumbled with the wrapping, aware of the guests who'd stopped their conversations to watch this strange, charged interaction. He opened the box. Inside, nestled in black velvet, was a watch. Not just any watch. The watch. A vintage Omega Seamaster with a leather band worn soft from years of use. Brandon's breath caught. He'd bought it from a pawn shop during their second year together, back when he was still pretending they'd build a future as partners. It had been the most expensive thing he owned, a symbol of the man he wanted to become. But when money got tight, when his networking lunches and new suits became more important than rent, he'd sold it without telling Monique. She'd cried when she found out. Not because she cared about the watch, but because it represented another piece of himself he was willing to sacrifice in his climb upward. Brandon turned the watch over with trembling fingers, and there, engraved on the back in elegant script, were 6 words. "Some things are better left in the past." The message landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading through his chest. Brandon looked up at Monique, searching for malice or triumph, and found only calm finality. "I had it restored," Monique said quietly. "Thought you should have it back." "A reminder of who you were before you decided who you wanted to be." Brandon opened his mouth to respond. To say what, he didn't know, but nothing came out. The weight of the watch in his hands felt like an indictment, a mirror reflecting every choice he'd made, every person he'd stepped over, every piece of his humanity he'd traded for proximity to power. "Monique, he faltered. "I didn't—" "You don't need to explain," she interrupted gently. "I understand now. You were climbing toward something, and I wasn't part of that vision. It hurt then. But it doesn't anymore. She glanced over her shoulder at Alexander, at her sons, at the life she'd built from the ashes of Brandon's rejection. When she looked back at Brandon, her eyes were clear. "I hope you find what you're looking for," she said. "I already found mine." Across the terrace, Lindsay emerged from the chateau and stopped cold. She watched Monique hand Brandon the gift, watched his face crumble and reconstruct itself, watched the intimacy of their exchange, an intimacy that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with unfinished history. And in that moment, Lindsay understood with devastating clarity. She wasn't the love of Brandon's life. She was a trophy, a checkbox, a pawn in someone else's petty revenge story that had just backfired spectacularly. She'd married a man still haunted by the woman he'd discarded, a man whose ambition was so consuming it left no room for actual connection, a man who'd invited his ex-wife to shame her and ended up revealing his own hollowness instead. Lindsay's hands tightened on her bouquet, crushing the delicate petals. Brandon watched Monique turn away, rejoining Alexander and her sons. He stood frozen, the watch heavy in his palm, champagne forgotten. Guilt flickered through him, hot and sharp and quickly suppressed. He couldn't afford guilt. Not here. Not now. He slipped the watch into his pocket and grabbed another glass of champagne from a passing server, downing it in 2 long swallows. The alcohol dulled the edges of what he was feeling, made it easier to force his face into something resembling celebration, but his hands still shook. Meanwhile, Monique reached Alexander, who pulled her close and kissed her temple. "All done?" "All done," she confirmed. Caleb tugged at her gown. "Mama, can we go now? I'm hungry." Monique laughed, genuine and light, the sound carrying across the terrace. Several guests turned toward it instinctively, drawn to joy the way flowers turn toward sun. Alexander scooped Carter into his arms while Monique took Caleb's hand. Together, the family of 4 began making their way toward the terrace exit, toward the pearl-white Maybach waiting in the circular drive. Guests parted for them, murmuring goodbyes and compliments that Monique acknowledged with gracious nods. Cameras flashed as they passed, the photographers unable to resist capturing this family that radiated something the wedding itself had lacked. As they reached the steps, Monique paused and looked back one final time. Not at Brandon. She was done looking at him. But at the garden, the chateau, the whole elaborate production. She'd walked into this space as a ghost from Brandon's past. She was leaving as proof of her own resurrection. Alexander opened the car door, helping the twins into the back seat before offering Monique his hand. She took it, settling into the soft leather with a sigh that released 6 years of weight. Caleb buckled himself in and looked at his mother with wide, curious eyes. "Did we do good, Mama?" Monique smiled, running her fingers through his hair. "You did perfect, baby. Both of you." Alexander slid in beside her, and the driver closed the door, sealing them in quiet luxury. Through the tinted windows, Monique could see guests still watching, still whispering, still trying to piece together the story they'd just witnessed. The Maybach began to pull away, and Alexander's hand found Monique's, threading their fingers together. "No regrets?" he asked softly. Monique looked at her husband, this man who'd chosen every part of her, who'd given her partnership instead of patronage, who'd built a family with her based on mutual respect rather than strategic advantage. She thought about Brandon, standing on that terrace with a watch he'd once sold, and a wife who'd already realized she was second choice. She thought about the girl she'd been, broke, heartbroken, and certain she'd never be enough. And she thought about the woman she'd become, successful, loved, and finally free. "No regrets," Monique said, leaning her head against Alexander's shoulder as the chateau disappeared behind them. "Let's go home." Chapter 8. Her silence was the loudest revenge. The first photo appeared online before Brandon and Lindsay had even cut the cake. A guest, someone's cousin with an Instagram following and an eye for drama, had posted a candid shot of Monique's arrival. The image was stunning in its composition. Monique stepping out of the Maybach in her blood-red gown, diamonds catching the light, her twins flanking her like small princes, and Alexander Pierce's hand at her back, protective and proud. The caption read, "When the guest arrives, more iconic than the bride. #wedding zen. Who is she?" Though, within an hour, it had been shared 3,000 times. By evening, it had gone viral. The professional wedding photographers, hired to document Brandon and Lindsay's perfect day, had made a fatal miscalculation. They'd done their job too well. Every shot of Monique was technically flawless. The way the afternoon light haloed her face, the elegant drape of her gown over her pregnant belly, the quiet power in her posture as she sat in the third row. Even the photos meant to focus on the bride and groom somehow made Monique the story. There she was in the background, glowing like a counter-narrative. The photographers submitted their preview gallery to the couple that night, as contracted. But by then, other versions were already circulating. Atlanta's society blogs picked up the story first. Peachtree Elite ran the headline, "Mystery Guest in Red Steals the Spotlight at Cooper Hart Wedding." Socialite Diary went further. "Who is the stunning woman who showed up pregnant with a billionaire? Brandon Cooper's ex-wife Monique Harris makes unforgettable entrance." By Monday morning, it had reached the tabloids. Snap Magazine. She came, she glowed, she conquered. How Monique Harris turned her ex's wedding into her coronation. The Daily Dish. Billionaire Alexander Pierce makes rare public appearance for his wife at her ex's wedding. The photos were everywhere. Monique in red, Monique with her twins, Monique and Alexander walking away from the chateau, looking like they'd just left a kingdom they no longer needed to rule. And in every single image, Brandon and Lindsay were either out of frame or reduced to background details in someone else's story. Lindsay saw the headlines over her morning coffee in the honeymoon suite they'd booked at the chateau. She sat in her silk robe, hair still perfect from the stylist, scrolling through her phone with growing horror as their wedding, her wedding, was dissected and reframed across social media. Every comment section was the same. "The bride is pretty, but did you see that guest? Imagine inviting your ex to shame her and she shows up with Alexander Pierce. That red dress is everything. Those twins, that pregnancy glow, that man, she won. Poor bride, this has to sting." Lindsay's hands trembled. She looked across the suite to where Brandon stood on the balcony, phone pressed to his ear, his shoulders tight with tension. He'd been fielding calls all morning, from his mother, his colleagues, friends who wanted to know what the hell happened. She rose slowly, crossing the room with her coffee cup gripped like a weapon. When she stepped onto the balcony, Brandon ended his call abruptly. "Lindsay, don't." She cut him off, her voice cold. "Just don't." He tried for his courtroom composure, the smooth deflection that usually worked. "The media is sensationalizing—" "You invited her," Lindsay interrupted, her voice shaking now. "You invited your ex-wife to our wedding. And don't tell me it was courtesy. Don't insult me with that." Brandon's jaw worked. He couldn't meet her eyes. "You wanted her to see you win," Lindsay continued, the realization settling over her like ice water. "You wanted her to watch you marry me and feel small. That's why you sent the invitation. This whole thing, our entire wedding, was about her." "That's not—" "I was a prop," Lindsay said, the words sharp and final. "A beautiful, well-connected prop in your petty revenge fantasy. Except it backfired, didn't it? She didn't come broken. She came better, and now everyone knows it. Brandon opened his mouth, searching for the right combination of words to fix this, to reframe it, to lawyer his way out of the truth. But there was nothing. No argument. No defense. Lindsay set her coffee cup on the balcony railing with deliberate care. "I'm going to shower. Then we're going to finish this honeymoon because I don't give people the satisfaction of knowing they broke me. But when we get back, Brandon, we're going to have a very different conversation about what this marriage actually is." She walked back inside, leaving Brandon alone with his phone, his champagne hangover, and the growing realization that he'd won nothing at all. He'd trapped himself in a marriage built on strategy rather than substance. He'd humiliated his bride in front of 300 guests and the internet. And worst of all, he'd given Monique Harris exactly what she hadn't even come seeking. Vindication so complete it required no words. Brandon gripped the balcony railing, staring out at the manicured grounds where, just yesterday, he'd stood believing himself victorious. Now he just felt hollow. Meanwhile, Monique woke in her Tribeca penthouse to the sound of her twins giggling in the kitchen. Sunday morning light spilled through floor-to-ceiling windows, and she could smell Alexander making his signature blueberry pancakes, the only meal he claimed to have mastered. She stretched, one hand resting on her pregnant belly, and reached for her phone out of habit. 53 text messages, 12 missed calls. Her social media notifications had been muted, but she could see the number climbing into the thousands. She scrolled through a few messages, friends sending her the articles, the photos, the headlines. "Girl, you broke the internet. That entrance will go down in history. You didn't just show up, you ascended." Monique smiled, set her phone down, and didn't look at it again. She didn't post about the wedding, didn't share photos or comment on articles or engage with the narrative spinning across the internet. She didn't need to. Her presence had spoken. Her silence now would speak even louder. She found Alexander in the kitchen, the twins seated at the counter covered in flour and stealing blueberries from the bowl. Caleb spotted her first and scrambled down to hug her legs. "Mama, Daddy's making the big pancakes." Alexander turned, spatula in hand, and his smile was warm and uncomplicated. "Good morning, beautiful. How'd you sleep?" "Better than I have in years," Monique admitted, kissing him softly. After breakfast, chaotic and perfect, with syrup somehow ending up in Carter's hair, Alexander disappeared into his study and returned holding an envelope. "I have something for you," he said, his tone shifting to something more serious. Monique opened the envelope and pulled out a portfolio of documents. Her eyes scanned the first page, then widened. "Alexander, the Harrison Pierce Legacy Fund," he said, watching her face. "A venture fund specifically focused on investing in women entrepreneurs, particularly women of color who've been overlooked by traditional capital. You'd run it, full autonomy. I'm just the checkbook." Monique looked up at him, overwhelmed. This is millions of dollars." "It's an investment in the future you believe in," Alexander corrected, "and in the woman you are. I've watched you build yourself up from nothing, Monique. Now let's build a legacy that helps others do the same." Tears pricked her eyes. The good kind. The kind that came from being seen and valued and trusted. She kissed him again, deeper this time, the portfolio pressed between them. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me. For believing in me. Always," Alexander murmured against her lips. Caleb, watching from the couch with his sticky hands and curious eyes, piped up, "Mama, did we win yesterday?" Monique pulled back from Alexander and walked over to her son. She knelt beside him, smoothing his hair back. "Win what, baby?" "I don't know," Caleb said thoughtfully. "Everyone was looking at us, and you looked so pretty. And Daddy was so tall. It felt like winning." Monique smiled, pulling both twins into her arms. We didn't come to win, my loves. We came to walk through like we owned it. And we did. That's all that mattered. Carter frowned. But what about that man at the party? The one you gave the present to? What about him? Monique asked gently. Did he win? Monique thought about Brandon, trapped in a viral news cycle. Facing a wife who now knew she was second choice, holding a watch that reminded him of everything he'd sacrificed for an image of success that felt increasingly empty. No, sweetheart, Monique said softly. He didn't win, but that was never my job to decide. I just needed to show myself how far I'd come. And I did. She stood, Alexander's arm slipping around her waist, her sons leaning against her legs, sunlight streaming through the windows of a home filled with love she'd earned and built and chosen. Somewhere, headlines were still being written, photos still being shared, Brandon still unraveling. But here, in this moment, Monique Harris was simply, perfectly at peace. Her silence was the loudest revenge she could have ever orchestrated, and it was enough. 6 months later, autumn painted New York in shades of amber and gold. Monique stood in the twins' new bedroom, larger than the entire apartment she'd shared with her mother in Atlanta, watching Caleb and Carter debate which backpacks to take to their first day of kindergarten. Morning light spilled through the windows, catching the dust motes that danced in the air, and she felt her daughter kick against her ribs, as if reminding her that this life, this beautiful, hard-won life, was real. Mama, is the blue one too babyish? Carter asked, his face scrunched with the seriousness only a 5-year-old could muster over backpack selection. Nothing you choose is babyish, Monique assured him, kneeling with some difficulty given her 8 months pregnant belly. You're growing up so fast, both of you. Alexander appeared in the doorway, already dressed in a charcoal suit, 2 lunch boxes in his hands. Gentlemen, we leave in 15 minutes. That means shoes and jackets. The twins scrambled into action, and Alexander crossed to Monique, helping her stand with gentle hands. He pressed a kiss to her temple, then spoke softly to her belly. And good morning to you too, little one. Monique smiled, leaning into him. This, the morning chaos, the lunch boxes, the kindergarten preparations, this was the life she'd built from ashes. Not perfect, but hers, chosen, earned. Ready for your keynote tonight? Alexander asked. Ready, Monique confirmed. Nervous, but ready. You're going to be magnificent, he said, and the certainty in his voice settled over her like a blessing. Across town, in a corner office that suddenly felt too small, Brandon Cooper sat behind his desk, scrolling through emails he couldn't focus on. The law firm where he'd worked for 6 years, the one he'd sacrificed so much to impress, was hemorrhaging clients. 2 partners had left last month to start their own practice, taking their biggest accounts with them. Brandon's billable hours were down. His performance review had been concerning. And at home, the penthouse he shared with Lindsay felt like a mausoleum. They barely spoke anymore, lived in separate rooms, kept different schedules. The divorce rumors that had started circulating 3 months ago weren't rumors. They were negotiations happening through lawyers, while they both pretended to the outside world that the marriage was intact. Brandon had gotten everything he'd climbed toward: the prestigious job, the society wife, the appearance of having arrived. And he'd never felt more like a failure. His phone buzzed with another message from his attorney. He ignored it, standing to stretch, moving to the window that overlooked Peachtree Street. And that's when he saw it. The billboard across the street, massive and unavoidable, advertising a luxury skincare campaign. The image stopped his breath. Monique. She reclined against cream-colored silk, her pregnant belly on full display, one hand resting protectively over it. She wore minimal makeup, her natural beauty radiating from the photograph. Her eyes gazed directly at the camera, at him, it felt like, with an expression of serene power. The tagline read, "Elevation isn't about where you start, it's about who you become." And in smaller text at the bottom, campaign directed by Monique Harris, chairwoman, Harris and Pierce Legacy Fund. Brandon stood frozen, staring at the woman he'd once texted a breakup to while she was shelving books for minimum wage. The woman he'd invited to his wedding to humiliate. The woman who'd transformed his petty cruelty into a catalyst for her own ascension. Something cracked open in his chest. Not quite regret, but something close to it. A dawning realization that arrived 6 months too late. 6 years too late. Maybe a lifetime too late. He hadn't just lost Monique. He'd never deserved her. She'd loved him when he had nothing, loved him with a purity and selflessness he'd mistaken for weakness. She'd poured herself into his dreams, believing in a future he'd promised but never intended to share. And when he'd outgrown his need for her support, he'd discarded her like she was disposable. But Monique Harris had never been disposable. She'd been a diamond he was too shallow to recognize. Brandon sank back into his chair, the billboard's image burned into his vision. Monique hadn't needed revenge. She'd simply lived well, and her success, radiant, undeniable, was the most devastating response she could have given him. He'd spent 6 years climbing toward an image of success that felt increasingly hollow. She'd spent 6 years becoming actually successful. The difference was annihilating. That evening, the grand ballroom at the Plaza Hotel glittered with the kind of wealth that whispered rather than shouted. 500 guests, philanthropists, entrepreneurs, investors, and power brokers filled the space for the Harris and Pierce Legacy Fund's inaugural gala. Monique stood backstage, one hand on her belly, breathing slowly. Her gown tonight was midnight blue, elegant and regal, cut to accommodate her pregnancy without hiding it. Diamonds glinted at her throat, a gift from Alexander, but more than that, a symbol of how far she'd traveled. Alexander appeared beside her, the twins freshly groomed in miniature tuxedos, looking like they'd been born for moments like this. "You ready, Mama?" Caleb asked, slipping his small hand into hers. "I'm ready," she said, squeezing back. The MC's voice boomed through the ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the founder and chairwoman of the Harris and Pierce Legacy Fund, Monique Harris." The applause was thunderous. Monique walked onto the stage, the spotlight finding her, and for a brief moment she was that girl again, broke, heartbroken, sitting on a pull-out couch wondering if she'd ever be enough. Then she opened her mouth and spoke. "6 years ago, I had $200 and a dream that felt impossible," she began, her voice steady and clear. "I'd been told I didn't fit, that I wasn't enough, that the life I wanted wasn't meant for someone like me." The ballroom was utterly silent. "I could have believed that story," Monique continued. "I could have let rejection define me, but instead I decided to write a different ending. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I refused to let someone else's limitations become my ceiling." She spoke for 12 minutes about resilience, about the women who'd been overlooked and underestimated, about building tables when you weren't invited to the existing ones. She spoke about her mother, about struggle, about the responsibility that came with success. And when she finished, the ballroom erupted. Not polite applause, but a standing ovation that felt like validation for every silent battle she'd fought. After the speeches, after the dinner, as the gala shifted into its social hour, Monique stood at the ballroom's entrance with Alexander and their sons, preparing to make their entrance for photographs. The press photographers were already assembled, cameras ready. "Here we go," Alexander murmured, his hand at her back. "Here we go," Monique echoed. They stepped forward together, Monique in midnight blue, Alexander in his impeccable tuxedo, Caleb and Carter flanking them like small princes. The cameras erupted in a symphony of flashes, light bursting around them like small suns. Questions were shouted from the press line. "Monique, how does it feel to launch the fund?" "Mr. Pierce, are you involved in the foundation?" "Monique, when's the baby due?" "Is it true you're directing 3 more campaigns?" Monique didn't flinch, didn't blink. She simply smiled, serene, powerful, completely at peace, and let the moment wash over her. She thought briefly of Brandon, wondered if he was watching the coverage, if he understood yet what he'd lost. Then she dismissed the thought entirely. He no longer occupied space in her story. This, the foundation, the family, the life she'd architected from ruins, this was her crown. And she hadn't waited for anyone to place it on her head. She'd forged it herself, from fire, from pain, from the unshakable belief that she deserved more than she'd been offered. Alexander's hand tightened on her waist. Carter tugged at her gown. Caleb waved at the cameras with unself-conscious joy. And Monique Harris, once broken, now unbreakable, stepped fully into the light. She didn't crash the wedding. She turned it into her coronation. The end.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.